Hey everyone, welcome back to Grid Chat. I'm your host, Marissa Tandon, and I have missed you these last couple of weeks. The 2025 season is officially here, which means that Lewis Hamilton now drives for Ferrari, Carlos Sainz drives for Williams, and we have 5 new rookies entering the chat. Today's episode is going to be 2025 predictions, both my own and also listener predictions, because I asked everyone to kind of weigh in on social media, Instagram, and in the Grid Chat server. Which also, this is a friendly reminder that if you want to be included in the listener sections of these episodes, make sure that you're following me on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and also that you're in the Grid Chat server, which you can join in the episode description right now. But before we get into 2025 predictions, I did want to talk a little bit about this year. I had so many opportunities, from going to Silverstone and being in the Red Bull garage, to going to Vegas and getting to see Lewis Hamilton's car up close. And I'm really thankful that a lot of those opportunities came from the fact that you guys wanted to see me doing those things, and that a lot of people were turning to me to answer their questions about Formula One. The main reason I started this podcast this year was because a lot of times I'm trying to answer questions in 90 seconds on short form social media, which is most likely, if you're listening to this podcast, how you found me in the first place. And a lot of times this sport requires an explanation that's longer than 90 seconds. And because I've hosted podcasts before, and because podcasts are very familiar to me as a medium in general, I figured that doing a podcast would be the best way to take this on. In this past year, this podcast has mostly been about race recaps. Every week we've broken down the race itself. I've tried to find ways to make sure that we're educational. Also, I've tried to make sure we're answering questions that people are asking throughout the race, especially the ones that you guys are reaching out to me about in general. And so over the past year, I've really noticed that a lot of the questions people are asking are questions that they felt like they were too embarrassed to ask, or that they were maybe too simple or basic. I've gotten a lot of messages from listeners and from people who follow me on social media saying that they previously felt like they couldn't ask questions in this space, and that the podcast and the community overall has been a big help of getting them out of that mind space and kind of actually taking the chance to ask a question. Now, the other thing I really noticed is that a lot of those questions are the same questions that people have. Sometimes these questions are questions that people feel like are too basic to ask, but then they ask them and 100 other people ask the same question. And so we are going to get into my 2025 predictions for this week, but I wanted to tell you a little bit about what my plan is for the off season. Starting next week, we're going to start something that I am lovingly referring to as Grid Chat University. Each week, we're going to break down something very basic about this sport. We have all the way from this week through Lights Out in Melbourne in March. And by the end of this weekly series, I'm going to make sure you know who's on the grid, some of the history of these drivers and why you should care about them, the histories of these teams and the legacies that they have, and how to pick a driver that you may want to support. Plus, we're going to talk about the basics of a race weekend, how it all comes together, what each part of it means. One of the things I've noticed a lot is that people have mentioned that they got into the sport through Drive to Survive, and then they were interested enough that they wanted to keep watching the sport, but they got there and they were like, what is qualifying? And I hadn't thought about it, but Drive to Survive actually doesn't cover qualifying or sprint weekend formats. There's a ton of the weekend itself that you actually wouldn't have known about. And while there's nothing wrong with just watching a race for the Grand Prix itself, I also want to make sure that if you want to be the type of person that gets into everything from qualifying and free practice sessions, that you have a chance to do that and you know what you're watching. So we'll break down qualifying, we'll break down the format of a race weekend as well. We're also going to break down some of the other basics that you're going to hear about, like tire strategy and what that means, why different tire compounds are used and the different strategies behind them, and things like aerodynamics and little parts of the car that you don't know about. We'll break down kind of tech talk, vocabulary, little things about this sport that you would need to know if you wanted to get into it. So the idea behind this Grid Chat University series is essentially just whether you are really into the sport and you've been watching it for a long time, or you're brand new to the sport and you have a lot of questions, or you're trying to get a friend into the sport for the first time, so that you can start listening now, and that by the time we get to Melbourne, you will basically be 100% set. You'll have picked a driver and a team to throw your undying support behind. You may have picked a couple of enemies as well, and overall you'll know the basics of the sport and maybe a little bit about strategy, the tech behind it, and a couple of other things. By no means should this feel like homework. It's really just an ideal situation where we can have a casual conversation and I can answer questions that you have. All of that being said, before that series gets started next week, if you have any questions whatsoever about Formula One, I'm going to make sure to include a question and answer section in every episode of this portion of the podcast, similar to the way that we have done questions when we've finished a race. But you can literally ask anything about Formula One that you want to know, whether it's a term that you've heard thrown around that you don't know, whether it is something about the history of Formula One, whether it's something about the qualifying format, whether it's something about a driver. It could be about historic beef or the way that teams approach aerodynamics. There are a couple of ways that you can send those questions. If you're listening to the podcast on YouTube, you can leave it in the comment section of the video right now. And if you're not listening to this podcast on YouTube, you can either go to YouTube and leave your questions in the comment section of this episode, or you can ask your questions via Instagram, TikTok, or Threads, or you can join the Grid Chat Discord server in the episode description below. Any of those places, you can drop your questions that you have for me, and I will make sure to include the answers in Grid Chat University in some capacity. So that series will start next week. Whether you're trying to get your best friend, significant other, or parent into Formula One, or you yourself yourself have questions or you just want a refresher, these next 2 months are dedicated to knowing everything you might need to know to get started in Formula One. All of that being said, let's get into the predictions for 2025 because, guys, we're about to have a year. And to be honest, I'm just going to get the fun stuff out of the way first because we all know that for the last year, I have been anticipating heavily Lewis Hamilton heading to Ferrari. And I want to get into it because, yeah, I'm really excited. I think there has been this idea that Lewis Hamilton is washed for some reason this past year. And I actually want to talk about this a little bit more in depth because I really feel like when we have these people, these athletes who are so good, like greatest of all time good, we get into this energy where we start to say, oh, they're just not as good as they used to be. They're washed. It's over. But a lot of that comes into the fact that we're constantly comparing their performance against the best they've ever been, which is better than anyone else. And so I think you have this energy where people are like, Lewis Hamilton is, he doesn't have it anymore. It's over. And then you have other drivers being like, that's literally not true. There's no world in which it doesn't become like Lewis is the greatest of all time. And then you had this past year, this like obsession with a direct comparison between George Russell and Lewis Hamilton. And I get it because in Formula One, you really do only have your teammate to be directly compared to. You're the only two that have the exact same machinery. You're the only two that have the exact same resources. But we also know 100% that Mercedes tested a lot of things differently between the two cars. They were really struggling with their setup and they have been for the last couple of seasons. And I think a lot of the negative energy that resulted from Lewis announcing that he was leaving really did carry through the full season. There was never really a time this season where it felt like Mercedes, Lewis Hamilton, George Russell, Toto Wolff, everyone was on the same page. We had so much negative, like from the press, from the team itself, from like the way that PR was being handled, and then negatives as well with the way that things were being spoken about after Lewis had announced that he was leaving. I think things got blown out of proportion on all sides. And I also think it's clear that there had been a rift that was there for a while. And I think we don't think enough about the fact that mentality is a very large factor in performance, especially in a sport like this. So when you look at Lewis's shining moments from this past year, you have Silverstone where he breaks this long run of not having won anything. And you also have his excitement to head to Ferrari. And all of that is to say that I think that this environment is going to be one that really works for him. Lewis is fulfilling a long-term dream of pretty much every Formula One driver of getting to drive for Ferrari. He'll close his career out there. And he's spoken a lot about his mental health and the toll that 2021 took on him. I think when you look at that and you look at how the team and maybe Lewis himself as well didn't really adjust to kind of recover from that. I think that has been a part of that negative performance, right? So now you're heading over to Ferrari. You have a teammate who has spoken so highly of you and has said, like, I want to learn from Lewis Hamilton. And you also have a team that appreciates what you bring to the table. Plus, on just an objective standpoint, Lewis has brought so much talent over to Ferrari already. People want to work with Lewis Hamilton. People want to sponsor the team that Lewis Hamilton is on. People want to sponsor Lewis personally. And people want to be fans of Lewis. His fans come over with the team. And so I think Ferrari is opening up this space where it feels like, okay, this is a very positive place. And I also think that Ferrari has been working very hard for the last couple of seasons to really bring themselves back to a championship level team. We saw that to an extreme degree this past season, especially at the end of the season. And I think we've just got so much kind of perfect energy and synergy coming together that Ferrari is going to have a very good run. And I think that Lewis moving over is going to be a pretty seamless situation. I will say that adjusting to a new car is going to take time, as well as adjusting to a new team, especially a team that primarily speaks Italian, which Lewis does not speak. He's working on it, but he doesn't speak it yet. So I think at the very beginning of the season, we're going to see Charles outperform Lewis at the top. But I don't think it will take very long for the two of them to start being around the same performance. And I will say my prediction, again, based on just vibes, okay? This whole episode is just based on vibes and my feelings and thoughts, okay? But based on vibes, I do think that Lewis will ultimately surpass Charles in the Ferrari. And I also think that a lot of that is going to come down to the way that the team has to decide who they're prioritizing. Assuming Lewis is able to adjust to the new car and really be able to perform in the same way as Charles and really bring something to the team, which I think inevitably he will. It's just a question of how long that adjustment period takes. I do think with Lewis on his way out and with the amount of money and kind of prestige that he's bringing to the team, I can already feel someone telling me Ferrari is bringing prestige to Lewis. I think it's a symbiotic relationship, okay? When we look at literally the jump in stock that we had just from the moment that Lewis Hamilton announced that he was coming, Ferrari skyrocketed in value. And there's been a debate for a long time about Lewis Hamilton being bigger than Formula One, and I think objectively it's just true. All of that being said, I think because you have Lewis kind of on his way out and Charles still has quite a bit of time left in his kind of tank, right? Ultimately, I think the priority has to be for Lewis to eventually get his 8th world title. We know that Lewis has signed a, I believe, 3-year contract with Ferrari. That may be a 2-1 or it may be 3 outright, but we know that Lewis is definitely going to be there for 25 and after the 26 regulations. Right now, the car is going to be the best that it could possibly be in these 25 regulations next year, and Lewis is going to be the youngest that he'll be while he's at Ferrari. I don't know that we see World Driver Championship happen this year, but I do think that it will be a focus for the next 2 seasons to prioritize Lewis over Charles. And I also think that the relationship between Charles and Lewis is going to be a pretty positive one rather than a contentious one. I think there's a difference between being put up against a teammate that you know can threaten you. Carlos and Charles are pretty much on the same level of how much time they have left, where they're going to be, and what they have done and what they haven't done, versus a situation where you know your teammate is heading out pretty soon. There's a lot that you can learn from him, and the team overall and your relationship to that team and the people that you get to work with are going to be strengthened by Lewis being there. I think we see Charles kind of take a back seat, be willing to be the second driver I don't even want to say second driver, because when you look at it, it's like, okay, they're both going to be very much prioritized and taken care of. I think though that Charles is going to be open to maybe taking a back seat to Lewis for a couple of years with the knowledge that it builds a team where he can definitely win his own championship after Lewis retires. And my other prediction about Lewis is I just don't see him retiring until he has that 8th. But there's also kind of this thing about a champion that once you have a taste of winning again, it's really hard to give that up. We saw that with Lewis this year, actually after Silverstone. We saw him kind of open back up and become who he used to be. The light behind his eyes was back and the happiness was back and this idea of being a champion was back, right? So as much as I want to say that I think things are going to go well as long as Lewis gets his 8th and then retires, I think it's possible you see Lewis get his 8th and then goes, what about 9 though? 9 sounds good. I like the sound of 9. So all of that being said, I think based of next year, 2025, Ferrari's teammate dynamics are going to be very positive. Ferrari's inner team personalities are also going to be very good. I do think the beginning of the season is going to take a little bit of time to kind of readjust. We also know that Ferrari is fully rebuilding their car. And that is actually, ultimately, it's a risk, but I think it's a positive because they're taking in all of the information that they have. They're building the best possible version of this car under these regulations, and they're moving forward with a positive energy, right? So I think potentially rough start to the season, but overall positive season, positive relationships, and potentially in the fight for both driver titles and constructors titles. They also have the added benefit of teams up in the forefront and also all over the grid, having rookies as their second drivers. Mercedes and Red Bull will both have rookies in their seats, whereas Ferrari and McLaren will both have very steady, accomplished drivers in their seats. So I think that's also something to remember. There's a lot of advantages, and I think Ferrari is a massive player next year. And I hope all of my Ferrari Delulu girls listening are like, yeah, give us the delusions. So that's Ferrari. Let's talk about Red Bull. I really honestly think Red Bull is going to struggle this year. We're in this situation, right, where they have tried but failed to kind of find the right teammate for Max. Checo was a good fit for a bit. And then this season, I think we really just had this energy of kind of, I wish I knew the best way to put it, but I really feel like Red Bull lost a lot of their fan support in the way that they managed kind of the Checo situation and the Daniel Ricciardo situation, which there's a whole thing that we could have about whether VCARB and Red Bull should be as closely knit as they are. But regardless of how we feel about it, it is how close they are, right? It's crazy and mind-blowing to me to think back to the beginning of the season where we all thought Daniel Ricciardo could potentially be Max's teammate this year. And I know people are like, oh, ow, RIP, please don't bring that up. But it's like, that really was something that we really thought could happen this year. We really, really thought that for a moment that 2025, our Red Bull driver lineup would be Max Verstappen and Daniel Ricciardo. Now, I don't actually necessarily think that that would have been the best fit, but I also don't know that I think that Liam Lawson and Max are going to kind of fit well together either. I think this year with Red Bull really reminds me of the year that Pierre Gasly was promoted to Red Bull. And if you guys remember, or even if you don't, here's a little refresher. Pierre Gasly was promoted from the junior team up to be with Max Verstappen. And not even midway through the season, they swapped Pierre and Alex Albon, who at that point was a brand new rookie. And while Alex did make it through the rest of that season and the following season, he was dropped in favor for Checo. And so I think part of the trouble is if you look at the way that Red Bull has focused all of their energy onto Max, which again, if you have a driver like Max, you absolutely should focus in on that and do what you need to do. But the problem is that because they've focused so much on that, the second driver kind of feels like an afterthought. And the trouble with Liam in particular is that I don't know that he's going to do well with being a support driver. I think Liam arguably has earned his spot in Formula One. I know a lot of people felt like he came out of nowhere or he didn't really earn this, but he's been a part of the Red Bull organization for a long period of time, and he's had some very impressive drives in other series before this. He's been very loyal to the organization. He knows what he's doing. And I think other than some issues that we saw this year, he does know how to drive in Formula One. And I think it's a possibility that he is a good fit for Red Bull itself, but I don't know if he's a fit to drive as a second driver to a champion. I think Liam has the hunger that you need to actually win championships and win races. And something that I think is interesting is that we talk a lot about these drivers and these guys being arrogant or having an attitude. And ultimately, I do think you have to have an arrogance to be able to do this. You do have to have sort of like a little bit of a kind of detachment from reality to say, let me get in this car and drive at 200 miles an hour around hairpin turns with other guys that also want to drive that fast and leave like a little paper clips worth of distance between our two cars. Like, you have to believe that you can do that. And to believe that you can do that, you have to have a level of arrogance, right? And so I think that Liam has that. I think Liam has the arrogance that you need to be a Formula One driver. And I think, unfortunately, because of his circumstances, of the drivers that he's replaced, the drivers that he's been associated with, the teams that he's been associated with, I think he's been set up for that arrogance to be construed as just negative energy, or this belief that he's earned something that he hasn't, or that he's entitled to something, when ultimately I think Liam really just wants to drive Formula One and believes that he can. And I think that if you construe any of these drivers kind of from one moment or another, or when they're first coming into Formula One, things that they've said, it's always going to come off as a little bit arrogant. There are some drivers that feel more inherently likable than others, and I think that Liam has gotten the short end of the stick. And I think a lot of that just has to do with the fact that it's like you're replacing one of the most beloved drivers in Daniel Ricciardo, and then when you do get your Red Bull seat, it feels like you are taking it away from another driver, Yuki Tsunoda, who's also very beloved. And so I actually think that Liam, in terms of his likability, I just think that it's actually not really his fault. But I also think he is a little bit of a hothead. And again, I think everyone in the Red Bull organization is a little bit of a hothead. Max is not well known for being very kind over the radio. I think it feels like for Red Bull, it actually is a positive, right? To have this energy of like, let's be as competitive as possible. I want to go all the way to the limit, and maybe I will cross a line or two on my way there. The question is going to be whether that is a fit for a team where you are not the lead driver. And I do wonder if Liam had been put in a situation where he actually got to be at the junior team for a full season, if this would be a better kind of entry point for him, right? Like if he had had the moment to say like, I want to move through this team and actually learn Formula One and be in Formula One for a little bit and garner some like kind of fan currency, I think there was a possibility that he could have been in a better situation. All of that being said, I feel like Liam has this moment where he's either going to really adjust the way that he drives and really adjust what he expects for himself and be able to be supportive to Max, or he's going to try to fight to prove that he belongs there after Max leaves. And I don't know that that's going to go over well. So that being said, I do feel like Red Bull has so much turmoil in people leaving, in people changing positions, in drivers changing, in the car changing, in losing Adrian Newey, in the problems that they've had this past year. The list goes on and on and on and on and on. And I think while Max will still be Max Verstappen, it's pretty difficult to stop that. You could put the kid in a lawnmower and I think he would be doing pretty well. I also think that this is going to be a tumultuous year year for Red Bull. And I think because of that, we're nowhere near a situation where this season becomes a season where we expect the same driver or the same team to just continue to win and win and win over and over and over again. And as much as I want everyone to have a good time, I really actually think this is better for the sport. I think it's good to get into a space where everybody is competitive again and we are not sure. We're going into the season, we're just genuinely not sure who would win. I love that feeling. And in terms of not being sure who's going to win, let's talk about our reigning constructors champions, McLaren. I really think McLaren's coming in and we're going to see them do well again. I also think the biggest weakness they had this past year was not being sure who they thought their best driver was. You have two very incredibly good drivers in Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri, but you also kind of had this situation where it felt like you lacked leadership that knew how to manage winning. When you're in a situation where you have two drivers who can be competitive with each other, I'm thinking back to kind of, not to say that these two drivers are the same or that the talent level is the same or that the accomplishments are the same, but the dynamic is similar, and we had one of these drivers actually make this comparison, Nico Rosberg and Lewis Hamilton in their Mercedes days. You had these two drivers who were actually able to compete with each other. And if you don't find a way to manage that, if you don't find a way to put rules down and to stick to them, then you start to have these drivers make their own rules, and the lawlessness of it can become a problem. And so I think the difference with Lando and Oscar and this McLaren situation, the papaya rules of it all, is that to some degree, I do think you saw that Lando and Oscar did have a respect for each other that hasn't gone over a certain line yet, like it has with Nico and Lewis in the past. But I do think it has the potential to get there. So I think we are going to come into a situation where these cars are very competitive, where they hit the ground running and that they continue to chase their constructors championship. But I think the trouble for McLaren comes in when the question becomes which one of them are being prioritized for the drivers championship. And if history is anything to go by, especially this past season, the answer is that they're going to let them kind of duke it out, and they're going to continue to not say who is being prioritized, and they're just ultimately going to continue to not prioritize someone. And if that is the case, I do think it is going to be detrimental to that team lineup. And I think after this season, this is a bold prediction, again, based on vibes and nothing else. If we see McLaren choose one of their drivers, the other driver is going to start looking elsewhere, because unfortunately you have two championship caliber drivers on the same team. And if Oscar believes that they're going to prioritize Lando, there's a moment where he starts to say, well, someone else would prioritize me. There's a moment where his team starts to look at it and say, we need to find the team that will prioritize you over Lando or over your teammate in general. And also we have to remember that this season there are so many rookies coming in, which means that there is a real possibility that in 26 there are teams looking for another driver that they can really hang their hat on. Now, the benefit for McLaren is that they do have a very deep bench of other drivers that could really do a good job in that second seat. But the negative is that you also have a lot of these drivers that are really good that are going to expect to be prioritized. I don't know. I think my prediction with McLaren is that if they can find a way to manage their interpersonal situation, their drivers, their kind of team principal, the team as a whole, if they can find a way to make it cohesive and find a way to make these drivers agree on whatever the plan is, then I think they become the next sort of potentially unstoppable team. But if we don't see Zach Brown and Andrea Stella come into this situation and say, like, these are our priorities, this is the way we're doing it, and we will not accept anything outside of that, then I think you start to have that situation where these guys don't necessarily feel very happy with their situation. Does that make sense? I guess what I'm predicting for McLaren is either a very tight ship that does very well and wins a lot of stuff, or a very messy situation that sort of compounds from this past year and builds. And at a certain point, you have a boiling point and it has to stop. It has to pop. Also, every time we talk about McLaren, I really desperately want to talk about Pato O'Ward. Pato, if you are not familiar, is a driver in IndyCar. He drives for McLaren in IndyCar. And we also saw him do some more Formula One testing this year, some more free practice sessions, and just being a little bit more involved in the McLaren side of things. And I I feel forever robbed that we know that Pato was originally potentially supposed to be in Formula One, but was unable to get his super license situation kind of figured out with the FIA, which ultimately he was in the Red Bull pipeline. And that required him to leave the Red Bull pipeline because they dropped him, knowing that they couldn't get him into Formula One when they needed him. And that led to him ending up with McLaren for IndyCar. I'm skipping a lot of steps and just kind of giving you those thoughts. But with that being said, I do wonder, potentially, do we find a way for Pato O'Ward to make his way to Formula One? And if so, what does that mean for the team? Because if we do kind of, if my mom had balls, she'd be my dad. But in the words of Max Verstappen, I did not make that up. I do think there's this possibility where you see McLaren cannot get it together in terms of who's in charge and who is prioritized. One of these drivers leaves to be prioritized elsewhere, and then potentially Pato O'Ward makes his long-awaited debut in Formula One down the line as a result of that. Again, not a 2025 prediction, just me spiraling out of control in the what-if universe. So I guess the headline of my McLaren feelings are potential disaster or potential champions, which are, I guess, sort of just the only options. Let's chat about a couple of other things, right? We're kind of moving our way down the grid. Mercedes. Mercedes, my big prediction, which I really don't think is groundbreaking, is that they're going to struggle to adjust to this new situation. We've got George Russell, who honestly did have a good season this season, but we also have him now needing to be able to lead Kimi Antonelli, a very, very fast rookie. And you also have the dynamic of the fact that Kimi Antonelli has been declared as the future of Mercedes, which is a situation that you would assume George Russell wanted to have as a title. So the question really remains how they're going to work together. One thing that is important to note is that George is one of the few drivers who has a contract that does end at the end of 2025 season. So George, as a driver, needs to be figuring out whether or not Mercedes is the spot for him, or if he needs to be campaigning for a seat at another team. There were rumors, and I want to be so clear that I believe that they were just rumors, that he was speaking with Audi at the very beginning of this year. And I think there's always the possibility that if a driver is starting to feel like their situation is not secure, they look for other places to go. That being said, I think George is very happy at Mercedes and wants to stay there. So the question will really be, how good is Kimi Antonelli? And I think that's something we all want to know. But I don't think it's a question that we'll have answered right at the top of the season. I think it's highly likely that Kimi struggles to kind of perform at the very beginning of the season, but I also think that that's just normal when you're just coming into a huge seat and he's jumping straight from F2 into one of the top cars, one of the top teams, no junior team behavior, no time to adjust, no real time in Formula One at all. And so with that being said, I think Kimi Antonelli is a driver who has an incredible amount of promise and also a driver whose team really wants him to do well. So I think Kimi is going to come in as prepared as humanly possible, but the question will be if it's still too much for him as a rookie. All of that being said, I think Mercedes has a potential to do well. I think potentially Kimi Antonelli really does grow into this next generation level talent. I do think it's going to take him more than a year. And I also think that Valtteri Bottas being brought over as a reserve driver again is a positive for that development for Kimi. As much as I would have rather have seen Valtteri in a seat this year, if he had to go into a reserve driver situation, I think Mercedes is a good fit for him because there's a possibility that one of those two seats opens up and he becomes that filler, or there's the possibility that he's just allowed to kind of stay in Formula One, show what he's worth, show how he helps develop a car, and potentially open himself up for a Cadillac seat or another seat that may open on the grid. Again, a reminder that we have an extreme amount of rookies coming into this season, and that there's always the possibility that that does not last the whole year. So where my eyes kind of are with Mercedes is, where do these drivers see themselves, and really who is the future of this team? Does Kimi Antonelli have what it takes to kind of make his career long and genuinely good? Does George have what it takes to be more important than Kimi Antonelli and kind of the future of that team and the youth of the team? Does Valtteri manage to kind of prove that he belongs back on the grid and find his way there? And at a certain point, does Kimi Antonelli need someone with that type of experience to kind of help him along? Because I do see a possibility where George sees that he should take his talents elsewhere. Kimi really does do well and show this promise and this speed that we believe he has. And someone like Valtteri comes in as we know, is a very strong second supportive driver and helps Kimi Antonelli get to that level of his kind of where he could be. Like, we see Valtteri come in and help Kimi become a stronger driver in the long term. I don't think you see Valtteri in a seat next year, which is, I want to be clear that I'm saying that, but I do think that there's a possibility that you could see him swap in 26 should we see that Kimi does need that kind of support and that George finds that he wants to go somewhere else. So I think my eyes with Mercedes are really on Kimi because we know what George brings to the table. We know what Valtteri brings to the table. We know what Toto believes, and we know where the car sits. The only thing we don't know about Mercedes is whether or not Kimi Antonelli can live up to the pressure of where he's at. And my hopes, honestly, for someone who has just such a golden retriever energy to him, I saw someone compare Kimi Antonelli to Peter Parker, like Tom Holland's Peter Parker, and I was like, oh yeah, that is why he seems so familiar. I hope that Kimi is able to kind of support himself and do well this year. I hope that he does live up to the expectations that he had put on him, and I hope this speed that he has also comes with an understandable control. Because honestly, I would love to see him become just as great as everyone wants to think that he is. And I hope that the pressure and the timing is right. I hope that he comes in and he is able to not kind of burn out quickly. So I don't know that that's necessarily a prediction. It's just I hope the kid does okay. Next prediction in terms of thriving in new relationships, Esteban Ocon is going to be very happy at Haas. I think Haas is very happy to have Esteban. I think Esteban was obviously very unhappy with the way things ended at Alpine, and I really hope that this situation is a good fit. And I do think it will be. I think Esteban and Ollie will potentially make a good driver pairing. I think that Ollie Bearman is going to have just a lot of fun. And I also think he's going to be very reliable, which allows Esteban to kind of have someone that he doesn't have to worry about, tension that just isn't there in the way that it's been for a lot of his career. And I think Ollie and Esteban will essentially just kind of be chill. I think Haas is going to be one of the least dramatic teams on the grid next year. My hope, at least. Then we have Carlos and Williams. And I know that a lot of the people listening right now want me to say that I think Carlos is going to have an amazing time at Williams. I think the car is suddenly going to be so much better than it was before. And I think that he is going to bring the team back to the, glory of time past. I think next year is going to be a rough one for Williams, but I would love to be wrong. One thing that we have to remember about Carlos moving to Williams is that he is used to a Ferrari, and now he's got to drive just 100% one of the most difficult cars on the grid to drive. We know that they have had an insane amount of kind of adjustment this past year, that this year they got a completely different steering wheel and there was a lot of adjustments there, that this is a team that's frequently strapped for cash, though with Carlos coming over, they're going to obviously have more of that money. And I believe they also have money that still exists from bringing Franco on, though the crash damage may have spent quite a bit of that. But I think Carlos is going to kind of have a year of struggling to adjust to a team that's just run completely different than the teams that he's been a part of recently. Carlos is going from a team that has money, experience, and talent across the board, a very strong driver in his teammate and someone that was pushing him, and a really strong team principal in Fred. And he's also coming from a world where he was really hungry to prove himself so that he could get the best possible deal. And it's not necessarily the deal that he got. He's coming from podiums, he's coming from wins, he's coming from being in the fight for constructors. And instead, he's going to be going to a completely different world. This is just going to be a bit of a culture shock for Carlos. Now, does that mean that I think forever his situation at Williams will not be a winning one? No. I just think that this year is going to be a rough one. And I also think it's going to be a hard one given that Alex was meant to be sort of the leader of this team, the future of this team. Again, kind of something similar to what we're talking about with kind of George and Kimi, where you have one driver who believes that you're building a team around them, and then you have another driver who comes in and kind of cancels that out. So I think you have Williams who has all of this damage from the 2024 season, which has definitely delayed what they're able to do for the 2025 car, a completely different culture, a completely different mentality, and also in this weird way, this expectation that Carlos is so much better than the team. There is a narrative that Carlos doesn't belong here and that it's just by circumstance that he ended up there. And while that may statistically just be true, Carlos has proven that he kind of belongs on the top half of the grid. It's also a mentality that I think could be pretty detrimental to his adjustment. If you come into a place and believe or being told or that the kind of mentality is like, how did you end up here? You deserve so much better. It makes it difficult difficult to focus, and also it makes it difficult to look at your own flaws. If there's a situation where something Carlos is doing needs to be changed, there may be this energy of not being sure that they can say that to someone. I think there's this like version of your career where you feel like you get to a place that you don't have to take advice or notes or, be told to change. And if Carlos and Williams believe that he is better than they should have, do they figure out how to tell him they do need him to change something? Do they know how to criticize him? Do they know how to tell him that, yeah, we lost or we crashed because of something you did wrong? Do they parse that out? I don't know. I think that some of that may be problematic. I think kind of like telling Carlos that, you don't belong here, you are too good to be here, we fought for everything we had, and this is such a boon for us, could be a negative to the way that the team kind of comes together. However, I do think Carlos has the potential, as we've seen with the way that he left McLaren and the way that he left Ferrari, to help build this team back up. Carlos has absolutely improved the teams that he's been a part of. And so I do think that there's a possibility that after an adjustment period, Carlos does leave Williams better than he found it. But I also don't know that I believe that Carlos stays at Williams very long term. I think Carlos and potentially everyone else are just looking at this as sort of a stop along the way. And I do wonder how long it takes him to lock in and if he comes in and is really, really focused. However, I want to make it so clear. I really think regardless of how long Carlos stays at Williams, ultimately, I think he will leave the team better than he found it. So I do think it will ultimately be a successful partnership. I just think it'll take a few moments for it to kind of get off the ground, for them to sort out everything that they're doing and to find a way to get a car that works for them. And also, I don't know how long that partnership is ultimately. But at the risk of repeating myself, I do think that it was a good choice for Williams. I do think it was kind of the only choice for Carlos. And I think now that they know that that's what they're doing, they're locked in. And last but not least, I want to talk about Fernando Alonso and Aston Martin. Fernando has now said that he's treating 2026 as his final year in Formula One. And I think that's something that we should have already known was coming. I think Fernando has already retired once. He's come back. He's not gotten to the point where he's winning. And I think Aston Martin is doing their best to find a way to start winning. But the question becomes, you have Adrian Newey coming in for 26. You have pretty much a blank checkbook when it comes to Aston Martin and what they're investing into this sport. The question is just timing. Would Fernando Alonso be in a better place if he were in his 20s? Probably, yeah. Wouldn't they all be, right? But I think the point here is that Fernando Alonso knows he's coming up to the end of his career. The question is how good 25 and 26 can be for him. And also, I do wonder if he really believes he still can win a driver's championship. That is what he has said he is chasing after. And I also know that most of us are experiencing Fernando Alonso at not his peak. There was a world where he was a world champion. And I think that when you get to a point where you are so great at your sport, there's also a moment where you have to kind of decide, where do I go past the point of tarnishing my own legacy? And I think that is kind of what Fernando's battling with right now. How many more seasons can he go being in the middle of the pack before everyone forgets how great of a driver he really was? And how much more time do you take away from your legacy of being a great driver or going to another series and doing something else? And how long do you kind of stay in a losing space? I think the trouble for Fernando and for Aston Martin is that even if Aston Martin can get to the point that they have a winning car, I think the timing will not line up for Fernando. I also think that there's a potential that this is kind of being brought up because of the fact that Yuki Tsunoda and Honda would like to be repaired eventually. And that would require either Lance Stroll or Fernando Alonso to not be in one of those seats. And for obvious extenuating circumstances, I'm not sure we'll see Lance Stroll leave it anytime soon. So the question I think here is, how much does Fernando have left in the tank? And what does this year look like? Because I think it's another transition year until Adrian starts working on the new car, the new regulations, the Honda partnership comes in. This 25 season might be a little bit of a dead season for them. And how much does that take a toll on Fernando, his legacy, and what he wants to kind of present himself as? So that being said, I think Fernando and Aston Martin are not long for this world. I think this season for Aston Martin is a transitionary one as they wait for their new partners. And I think 2026 is the potential where you start to really see that team take off. The question is, how long does Fernando stay? And as a Yuki Tsunoda fan, I will admit, I would like to see Yuki stay in Formula One. And I think one of his biggest possibilities of doing that is staying at Aston Martin, which requires one of those drivers to kind of move out of the way. Should that be Lance? Should that be Fernando? I don't know. But if Fernando is saying that he wants to leave, it's possible that that's part of it. And then the biggest kind of change that we have this year is 5 rookies entering the grid. I also want to point out, that there's no part of the grid that is safe from rookies. Two teams at the top of the grid in Mercedes and Red Bull have rookies. Teams in that middle sector also have rookies, Haas and VCarb, and you have a rookie at stake. The biggest prediction that I have when it comes to our rookies is that the safety car drought that we had this year will be ending. I think we're going to see more safety cars, more crashes, hopefully. That's not the case, but I do think it's possible. I think there's going to be, though, this kind of chaos that comes back to Formula One this year that I think is really fun. Crashing, obviously, is not very fun, but the kind of riskiness that rookies take, the excitement that you have of having so many new personalities on the grid, and the shakeup of having so many people move around is going to bring us overall way more exciting racing, closer racing, multiple race winners, probably multiple safety cars and crashes, and ultimately, I just think 2025 is going to be such a fun, good season, and I'm really excited for it. But that kind of covers all of my basic predictions, and I know you guys are here for my opinions and my vibes, so that's why I've been yapping for all this time, but I want to get into the listener predictions that you guys sent in. So let's dig in. I actually tried not to read these before I started recording because I wanted to make sure that I didn't change any of my predictions. So everything that you've heard so far has literally no bearing on what you already said to me. So if some of these are repeated, I apologize. And also if some of them are the same, then you and I think alike. And that's pretty cool. It's pretty almost romantic. Okay, Becky says Lando or Oscar at WDC. Oh my God, I just realized I did not predict my driver's champion. I think Lando or Oscar is actually very possible. I think, again, the question is how much does McLaren sit down and figure out what their strategy is, and does everyone agree with it? Jack dropped mid-season? No, I hate that news. I know there's this big rumor that there's this possibility that Jack is going to be replaced with Franco before the season even starts. And I have to be honest with you, I love Franco, but I also really feel like Jack deserves his chance in Formula One, and I don't want to see that. I would like to see that prediction be very wrong. Lewis will win his 9th, really 8th in parentheses, and Charles will be 2nd. Yeah, I could see that, honestly. I do think, I think for me, like I said earlier, I do think it's most likely that Lewis's 8th championship comes in 26, but I would love to see it happen in 25. You want to know why? I love him. Okay. Liam Lawson might actually do better than we expect. See, this was from the username. I apologize if I pronounce this incorrectly. It's Halyal, Halyal. Anyway, Liam Lawson getting a good rep is actually something I hope to see in Formula One this year, because I do think that he, again, like I said earlier, just got put in a bad situation, and I think it's possible that potentially he locks in over this break and really does kind of perform in a way that we're surprised by. So I hope your prediction is correct. Lando or Oscar get WDC. My money is on Lando. Okay, so this is a popular one. And Lewis is in the top 3. It's still a McLaren year. I definitely could see that. Again, I think if everyone locks in, everyone has an agreement on what we're kind of focused on, then I think it's really possible we see them win again. Lando WDC, Ferrari WCC with the emoji of the monkey covering its eyes. This, I think, is potentially what we call the Ferrari delusion, but a bug I've been bit by as well. Fernando announces retirement. See, okay, I think we're on the same page here, Meg. I really do think that Fernando is kind of on his way out. I do wonder, again, given the fact that there's the whole Yuki and Honda of it all, do we see him leave before 26, which he's saying is kind of his final year? I think if this year sucks, it's really possible that he does. Oscar will win more races than Lando next season, from Liz. Yeah, okay, I can see this one. As I said, you heard me kind of yap for a while. I think McLaren is in a situation where they have 2 really competitive drivers. And also, this past year, we did see Oscar eventually take a back seat for Lando. So I can see him coming in kind of guns blazing and trying to prove at the beginning of the season that he's the driver that they should be focused on this year. And if that's the case, you may see him kind of really, really lock in. I honestly cannot tell you where my gut is, because I feel like Lando is the one that I would assume that McLaren would favor. But at the same time, I didn't necessarily see that happen as fast as I thought it would have this year. So I think it's possible. Manifesting a Lewis WDC and Ferrari World Championship, aren't we all? Ferrari Constructor Championships and Leclerc Driver Champion may be the Delulu, but oh well. Again, I'm right there with you. We've got a bunch of Ferrari Delulu. I'm going to run through these. Ferrari Delulu, Charles WDC, Ferrari WCC, Ferrari having the top 2 drivers because of a papaya rules type situation with team orders, And then we also have a Charles versus Max WDC race, which is interesting. I think there's this idea that potentially Max continues to push despite Red Bull not necessarily giving him the tools he needs, or that the kind of turmoil that we've talked about at Red Bull being a struggle, but Max still pushing through. I could see that. But I also am not sure that this year is Max's year. Papaya rules are about to be spicy this year. I agree. But hopefully spicy, like at the very beginning of the meal, and then we have some milk and everyone focuses in. V-Carb drops a driver mid-season. Could see this. I could also see potentially a driver swap in the same way that we saw with Pierre and Alex. There is this very, very small possibility that we see Liam and Yuki actually swap mid-season. Again, very minuscule possibility, but a possibility nonetheless. Max doesn't win the championship. I would agree. I feel like my predictions aligned with that. I feel like there's just going to be a race. There's going to be a lot of possibilities of who actually could be winning. And I do not think there will be this strong lead from the beginning of the season like Max had this year. 2 rookies crash out in the first races of the season. Viva la safety car. Gotta see it. Hamilton wins the championship this year. Wouldn't we love that? We're all manifesting that. And if you're not manifesting that, that's okay, but why? Williams on the podium. This one, I'm not sure I see, but I do love the energy. Charles, WDC, Oscar as the challenger, and an Antonelli podium. That one's kind of fun. I kind of like that. I think Charles has been pushing for a long time. I do think there's a possibility that with Lewis coming in, we do see him deprioritized for a couple of years until Lewis gets what he needs. Never say never. We also have Oscar as the challenger and an Antonelli podium. I kind of love this. I love the idea of Kimi actually, again, like I said earlier, I want to see him live up to the expectations. So I would love to see him on a podium this year. There's a Williams somewhere it shouldn't be, like top 5 grid starting position or something. This I do like, and I do think I could see that. I could see this kind of shocking moment. The real question is, Alex or Carlos? Probably Carlos. We're going to have a race where half the grid DNFs. Again, very possible. I do think we're going to see a little bit more chaos this year than we're expecting. Alonso and Sainz podium, Max WDC, Oscar second, and McLaren WCC. A lot in this one. I think there's something about this is very storybook. I love the idea of Alonso and Sainz on the same podium. Would love to see that. Max winning championship again, possible. And I think if he does win it, it will be one of those situations where he really fought for it. Lewis gets his 8th, (9th), WDC, and Ferrari wins WCC. Again, welcome to the club, girly pop. Franco Colapinto to Cadillac. Interesting one. And that was actually the last prediction I have. We didn't talk a lot about Cadillac, though this will be kind of a looming kind of shadow this season of this idea of 2 new seats being available for the 26 season and so many drivers not being committed. I want to see Franco back on the grid, but I will tell you, I think it will come from someone else moving Cadillac or another seat coming open and Franco ending up in a vacated seat. I think the situation with Cadillac is that there's an expectation that there will be at least one American driver. And I also think it's very possible that we see them pull from the Andretti stable just based off of where their funding's coming from, who's in charge of their team, or things like that. So I'm not sure that we necessarily see Cadillac go with current Formula One drivers that you're familiar with, unless it's a kind of situation where they want one American driver and one very experienced driver, which then again, I don't think would be Franco or another rookie. But again, just vibes. We don't know enough about Cadillac yet to really know where we're going. And I'm excited for that. Overall, I think the season is going to be so fun. I hope you guys are excited. Based off of your predictions, I think everybody's very locked in. And I hope you had some fun. I would love to know if you did not have your prediction read, or you had a prediction that didn't make it in time, or you didn't know I was asking for predictions. Do you have any predictions for this season? You can either leave those in the comments on the YouTube version of this, or let me know over social media, or jump into that Discord server as always and let us know in there. We're always chatting. And again, we may be on the off season, but I don't want to go anywhere. I want to talk. I want to yap about Formula One. So we're going to do that every week. Come back for Grid Chat University starting next week and lock in. And also, 'tis the season to get your friends into Formula One. So sit them down in front of Drive to Survive. Give them the link to this podcast so that they can lock in with this every week and really answer all the questions they may have. And you don't even have to answer them. I'll answer them for you. And don't forget to send in any questions that you have that you want me to cover as we prepare for the 2025 season of Formula One. As always, I'm never going to shut up. And I'm so glad that you guys are here to listen. I had a great year with you last year, and I am super excited for a fantastic 2025, an exciting one. And hopefully I will see you both on the internet and at races. Thank you so much for joining me for all of 2024. And I am really excited to continue hanging out with you all year long. See you next week.